In 1930, a woman stood at the window of America's largest private residence. 250 rooms surrounded her. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 4 acres of floor space. She owned none of it. Her name was written in marble. Her portrait hung in galleries. Her grandfather built an empire that reshaped the nation. But when she tried to speak, the family made sure no one could hear her. This is the story of Cornelia Vanderbilt, the only child of Biltmore Estate, and the mechanisms of silence that protected a dynasty. The year is 1877. New York City, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, dies at 83. His fortune is estimated at $100 million. In today's currency, that equals nearly $300 billion. He built it through railways, through steamships, through ruthless consolidation and strategic destruction of competitors. His dying words to his son William were not about family. They were about preservation, about dynasty, about ensuring the name would outlive the man. The Vanderbilts understood something fundamental about American aristocracy. Europe had bloodlines stretching back centuries. America had only wealth, and wealth required architecture, not just buildings, but the architecture of power itself. William Vanderbilt inherited the bulk of his father's fortune. He doubled it within 8 years. But he understood that money alone would not grant his family permanence. They needed monuments. And so the construction began. The breakers in Newport, Marble House, Vanderbilt mansions rising across Manhattan like cathedrals to Capitol. But it was William's youngest son, George Washington Vanderbilt II, who would build the most ambitious monument of all. George was different from his brothers. Quiet, scholarly, he preferred libraries to boardrooms. He spoke 8 languages. He collected rare books and studied horticulture. His family considered him weak, but George understood legacy in ways his brothers did not. He knew that power expressed through ostentation would eventually collapse. Power required permanence. It required land. In 1888, at 26 years old, George visited Asheville, North Carolina. The mountains, the isolation, the vast stretches of forest that could be shaped into something eternal. He began purchasing land, acre by acre, farm by farm. Eventually, he would own 125,000 acres. And at the center of it all, he would build a house that would make European nobility envious. Biltmore Estate. Construction began in 1889. 1,000 workers, 6 years of labor. Richard Morris Hunt, the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designed the chateau. Frederick Law Olmsted, creator of Central Park, designed the grounds. The estate would have 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a private library containing 23,000 volumes. It was not a home, it was a declaration. But there was a problem. George was approaching 40 years old. He had no wife, no children, no heir. A monument without succession is just a tomb. In 1898, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She came from old New York society. The Stuyvesants were one of the original Dutch families, respected, connected. Poor by Vanderbilt standards, but rich in pedigree. Edith was 25. George was 43. The wedding took place in Paris. Quiet, private, no press, no spectacle. This was not a love match. This was strategy. 2 years later, on August 22, 1900, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born at Biltmore Estate. She was the only child George and Edith would ever have. And from the moment of her birth, she was not a daughter. She was a vessel, a continuation. The single fragile thread holding together one of America's greatest fortunes. The early photographs of Cornelia show a child who never smiles, always in white, always proud, always surrounded by adults whose job was to shape her into something worthy of her name. She was educated entirely at home. Tutors for French, German, literature, music, deportment. She learned to curtsy before she learned to run. She learned which fork to use before she learned what it meant to choose. Her playmates were selected. Her schedule was managed. Her correspondence was monitored. She was 7 years old when she wrote her first letter. It was to her grandmother. The letter still exists in the estate archives. The handwriting is perfect. Too perfect. Each letter carefully formed, not the writing of a child, but the writing of a child performing childhood. It reads, "Dear grandmother, I am well. I practice piano each day. I am obedient. I hope this finds you in good health. Your loving granddaughter, Cornelia. Not a single personal thought, not a single moment of genuine expression, just performance. By age 10, Cornelia could converse in 3 languages. She could identify rare orchids in the estate greenhouse. She could play Chopin, but she had never attended a public school, never made a friend her parents had not approved, never spent a single day outside the boundaries of surveillance. The estate records from this period show something disturbing. Staff were required to submit daily reports on Cornelia's activities, what she said, what she read, who she spoke with. These were not the actions of protective parents. These were the actions of people managing an asset. Then, in 1914, everything changed. George Vanderbilt traveled to Washington, D.C. for emergency surgery, an appendectomy. Routine by the standards of the time, he died on the operating table. Complications, sudden, unexpected. Cornelia was 13 years old, and overnight the architecture of her life shifted. George's will was read in private. The estate, all 125,000 acres, the chateau, the fortune attached to it, was placed in trust. Edith would control it, manage it, make all decisions regarding its operation and preservation. Cornelia would inherit, eventually, when she came of age, when she married, when she proved herself capable. But capability would be defined by others. The will contained a clause. If Cornelia was deemed, and these are the exact words, incapable of responsible stewardship, control could remain with trustees indefinitely. Who would determine capability? The family, the lawyers, anyone except Cornelia herself. She was 13 years old, and her fate was already sealed. The years between 1914 and 1924 are strange in the historical record. Cornelia appears in society pages, at charity events, at estate functions, always beside her mother, always silent. There are photographs from a 1920 Christmas celebration. Cornelia is 20 years old. She stands beside the estate's enormous Christmas tree. She wears an evening gown, pearls, her hair perfectly arranged. Her eyes are empty. In 1922, Edith brought Cornelia to England, a social tour, presentations at court, meetings with appropriate families. This was not a vacation. This was a marriage market. And in London, Cornelia met John Francis Amherst Cecil, the Honorable John Cecil, son of Lord William Cecil, descended from 2 British prime ministers, diplomat, well-connected, well-bred, poor. The Cecil family had titles. They had history. What they did not have was money. The arrangement was perfect. John needed a fortune. Cornelia came with one. Edith needed someone capable of managing the estate's complex operations. John had experience in administration and diplomacy. And Cornelia? What did Cornelia need? No one asked. The engagement was announced in 1923. The wedding was scheduled for April 1924. Cornelia was 23 years old. She had never been allowed to make a significant decision in her life. And now she was not being allowed to make this one either. But she went along with it. What choice did she have? April 29, 1924, Biltmore Estate. The wedding of Cornelia Vanderbilt and John Francis Amherst Cecil. 1,200 guests. The ceremony held in the estate's entrance hall beneath ceilings painted with Baroque clouds. The bride's gown cost $8,000. The flowers were imported from France. The champagne from the estate's own caves. National newspapers called it the wedding of the decade. Photographers were allowed on the grounds for the first time in an estate history. The public was fascinated. American heiress marries British aristocracy. It was a fairy tale. But fairy tales are always lies. The marriage contract, the actual legal document signed before the ceremony, tells the real story. John Cecil was named official manager of Biltmore Estate. He would oversee all operations, all finances, all decisions regarding land use, staff, and investments. Cornelia retained her position as heir. Her name remained on documents, but her authority was theoretical. In practical terms, she had just signed away any control she might eventually have had. The honeymoon lasted 6 weeks. Europe, the usual tour, Paris, Rome, the Swiss Alps. When they returned to Biltmore, John immediately took over the estate offices. He hired new accountants, restructured staff hierarchies, began implementing agricultural changes to make the estate profitable. Edith approved everything. She and John worked closely. Daily meetings, shared priorities. Cornelia was not included in these discussions. Her role was different now. She was expected to be a wife, and soon, a mother. In 1925, Cornelia gave birth to her first son, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, named for his grandfather. The press celebrated. The Vanderbilt line was secured. In 1928, a second son, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil. Cornelia had done her duty. She had produced heirs. Continuation was assured, and now she was no longer necessary. The letters begin in 1927. Cornelia wrote to a childhood friend, one of the few relationships she had maintained from before her marriage. The friend had moved to New York. They corresponded regularly. These letters were saved. They were donated to the estate archives decades later, and they reveal something the public was never meant to see. In one letter dated March 1927, Cornelia writes, "I am a portrait on the wall. People look at me and see only the frame. I speak and no one hears words, only the echo of my name." In another from August 1927, "The house is beautiful. I walk through it like a guest. I do not touch anything without permission. I do not decide anything without approval. I exist here, but I do not live." And then in November 1927, something sharper. They wanted an heir, not a daughter. They wanted a vessel, not a voice. And now that I have served my purpose, they would prefer I disappear entirely. These are not the words of a woman experiencing casual unhappiness. These are the words of someone suffocating. But she could not leave. Where would she go? The estate was her identity. Her name was her prison. So she stayed. And something inside her began to break. By 1929, Cornelia had stopped attending public events. The estate released statements citing health concerns and a need for rest. Newspapers printed polite updates. Mrs. Cecil is recovering from fatigue. Mrs. Cecil has retired from public life to focus on family. What they did not print was what the staff whispered, that Cornelia spent days in her rooms, that she would not speak to her husband, that she had been heard arguing with her mother behind closed doors. What they did not print was that Cornelia had tried to leave. In January 1930, Cornelia packed a bag. She told one of the housemaids she was going to New York, to stay with friends, to have some time alone. She made it as far as the estate gates before John stopped her. There are no official records of what happened next, but the staff member who witnessed it wrote about it years later in a private memoir. John and Edith sat Cornelia down in the library. They spoke to her for hours, about duty, about responsibility, about what people would say if she left, about the terms of her father's will, about the clause regarding capability. They did not threaten her explicitly. They did not need to. The message was clear. If she left, she would be declaring herself unfit. And if she was unfit, she would lose everything. Her sons, her inheritance, her name. She unpacked her bag and she stopped trying to leave. But something had shifted. Cornelia was no longer compliant. She was no longer performing. She was angry. In 1930, she began appearing at dinners late, disheveled. She would sit silently while guests spoke, then leave abruptly. She stopped hosting, stopped smiling for photographs. The family was concerned, not about Cornelia's well-being, about appearances. In 1931, Edith wrote to a family friend. The letter still exists. In it, she describes Cornelia as increasingly difficult and resistant to guidance. She writes, "I fear she has inherited a certain instability. It manifests in defiance, in behavior unbecoming of her position. We are managing it privately, but it is a source of great concern." Note the language: instability, defiance, unbecoming. Not pain, not suffering, not a woman trapped in a life she never chose. Just instability, the same word that had been used to institutionalize thousands of women in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Women who refused marriages, women who wanted control over their own money, women who spoke too loudly, women who were inconvenient. In 1934, Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil disappeared from public record. There was no announcement, no farewell, no explanation. 1 month she was there, the next month she was gone. The estate released a brief statement. Mrs. Cecil has chosen to travel abroad for an extended period. The family requests privacy during this time. But the documents tell a different story. In March 1934, Edith Vanderbilt petitioned the estate trust for emergency authorization to make unilateral decisions regarding Biltmore's operations. The reason given: the prolonged absence and concerning behavior of the primary heir necessitate immediate action to preserve estate interests. No medical documentation was provided, no testimony from Cornelia, no explanation of what concerning behavior meant. The petition was granted within 2 weeks. 1 month later, John Cecil petitioned for sole legal custody of George and William. The petition cited maternal unfitness and abandonment of parental responsibilities. Again, no evidence, no testimony, just language. The court granted custody to John. Cornelia was not present at the hearing. There is no record she was even informed it was happening. Her sons were 8 and 6 years old, and just like that, she had lost them. Where was Cornelia during all of this? The historical record goes silent. Some sources suggest she went to Europe. Others claim she was staying with friends in New York. But there is another possibility, one the family would never acknowledge. In the 1930s, it was not uncommon for inconvenient women to be quietly removed. Not through legal commitment, that required evidence, but through private arrangements, sanitariums, rest homes, places where women could be kept comfortable, medicated, and silent. There is no proof Cornelia was institutionalized, but there is also no proof she was free. What we know is this: between 1934 and 1949, Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil does not appear in any public records. No photographs, no society pages, no letters. 15 years of silence. In 1949, the silence breaks. Legal documents filed in North Carolina record the divorce of John Francis Amherst, Cecil and Cornelia Stuyvesant, Vanderbilt Cecil. The proceedings were private, no details released. The estate issued a single sentence: the family wishes both parties well in their future endeavors. Cornelia received a financial settlement. The exact amount was never disclosed, but estate records suggest it was substantial. But it was not Biltmore. It was not her inheritance. It was not her sons. It was payment for disappearing quietly. She was 49 years old. 1 year later, in 1950, Cornelia married Guy Bear, a British diplomat, minor aristocracy, kind by all accounts. They lived in England, a quiet life, no estates, no monuments, no dynasty. For the first time in her life, Cornelia was not a Vanderbilt. She was just a woman. She never returned to Biltmore Estate, not once, not for holidays, not for her son's weddings, not ever. When asked about her childhood, she would say only, "I prefer not to discuss the past." When asked about her mother, she said nothing at all. In 1958, Edith Vanderbilt died at age 86. She had controlled Biltmore Estate for 44 years. She had preserved it, expanded it, turned it into a profitable enterprise. The obituaries praised her as a visionary, a protector of history, a devoted mother. Cornelia did not attend the funeral. In 1976, Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil Bear died in England. She was 75 years old. Her obituary in American newspapers was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned her birth at Biltmore, her marriage to John Cecil, her 2 sons. It did not mention the 15 years of silence. It did not mention her second marriage. It did not mention that she had spent the last half of her life as far from her family as geography would allow. It mentioned only her lineage, because that was all she had ever been allowed to be. Today, Biltmore Estate is the most visited historic house in America. Over 1 million people walk through it every year. They admire the Flemish tapestries, the Renoirs and Sargents hanging in the galleries, the gardens designed by Olmsted, the library with its leather-bound first editions. Tour guides tell them about George Vanderbilt's vision, about Edith's careful preservation, about how the estate survived the Depression when so many others were lost. They mention Cornelia briefly. The only child, she married John Cecil. They had 2 sons who eventually inherited the estate. That is all. Her letters are not on display. Her portraits are relegated to secondary hallways. The court documents regarding her custody battle are archived, accessible to researchers, but rarely examined. Her voice has been edited out of the official history, and no one asks why. Because to ask why would be to acknowledge something uncomfortable. that wealth does not grant freedom, that legacy can be a cage, that women, even wealthy women, even white women of enormous privilege, could be erased when they became inconvenient. That power protects itself, not through violence, not through scandal, but through silence. The Vanderbilt family has never issued a statement about Cornelia's removal from Biltmore. They have never addressed the custody hearing, the divorce, the decades of absence. They have simply moved forward. The estate thrives, the family name endures, and Cornelia has been reduced to a footnote. There is a portrait of Cornelia Vanderbilt hanging in the estate's second-floor gallery. She is 17 in the painting, dressed in white, standing beside a tall window. Light falls across her face from the left. Her expression is calm, composed, unreadable. Tourists pass it every day. They glance at it. Some take photographs. Most move on quickly. There are more famous paintings in other rooms. No one stops to ask what she was thinking when she sat for that portrait. No one asks what happened to her after it was finished. No one asks why she never came back. Perhaps no one wants to know, because to know would be to acknowledge that the beautiful house they are touring was built on something other than vision. It was built on control, on inheritance structured as imprisonment, on the quiet erasure of anyone who resisted. Cornelia Vanderbilt was born into one of the wealthiest families in human history. She lived in the largest private home in America. She had everything, except a voice. And when she tried to speak, they took even that. Wealth does not always grant freedom. Sometimes it only perfects the cage. Sometimes the most effective prisons are the ones made of marble and gold, the ones tourists pay to admire. And sometimes the cruelest silence is not the silence of forgetting. It is the silence of deliberate erasure, of choosing not to remember, of reducing a life to a footnote because the full story threatens the monument. Cornelia Vanderbilt lived 75 years, but in the official history of Biltmore Estate, she exists for only 24 of them. The rest has been carefully, quietly, permanently erased, and the house stands. Beautiful, preserved, perfect, built on silence.